If you have a church Bible, we'll be on page 1073, as we read earlier from James chapter 2, verses 1 to 13. Page 1073. And again, if you want one, to put your hand up, and I'm sure someone can bring you one. Now, what do you think are the main differences between slaves and children? What are the main differences between slaves and children? Well, there are many, and I'm sure that you can think of many even now. And here in this passage in James, I think we get to see one of the key differences between the two. You see, a slave master, a slave owner, he tells the slave what to do. He doesn't feel any need to explain why or what the purpose is. He just says, do it, and the slave is supposed to do it. But a parent, at least some of the times, explains why. Now, children, sometimes your parents won't explain why, and they'll just say, because I said so. And if they do, my advice would be, listen. But sometimes they will explain why you should do what they're asking, and when they do, that's really kind of them. A slave master would never do that and just say, go do something. Instead, he just says it, rather than explaining himself. And here in this part of James, and I think throughout the book of James and throughout the whole Bible, that's what God does with us. He tells us what to do, what not to do, and then he goes on to explain why, just as a father would with children. This is him, our Father, teaching us his ways. So James, writing from God, he is straight with them, he's nice and direct, but he calls them his beloved brothers and sisters, his beloved brethren. It's like he's writing to them, a fellow brother, on behalf of the Father. So God is teaching his church through James, and I hope that that happens with us this evening. So looking at our verses, we can see from the very start that there's a problem in the church, and James tells them to stop showing it, and that is favoritism or partiality towards the rich. Straight away in verse 1, James says, don't do that. And we're going to look at what he means there and try and understand what exactly he's getting at. And then we'll move on to see him explaining why we need to act this way and how as well. So our sermon will be in two parts. First of all, do not show favoritism, verses 1 to 4. Nice and clear for us there. And then verses 5 to 13, this is the why we shouldn't show favoritism and how. And in the end, we'll see that the overall message is that we need to love all of our neighbours. And I think if we look at verse 1, then we'll see that this text, like with all of James, is all about living out the faith that we have in Jesus, the faith that we hold on to. You see, James isn't about just works and actions. He's about, first of all, having faith in Jesus and then living a life that reflects that. So first of all, verses 1 to 4, do not show favoritism. He gives us an example of a really bad welcome from a church, doesn't he? You see, we should come away tonight thinking, I don't want to show partiality or favoritism towards people anymore. As Tom said, partiality, it's similar to favoritism. Maybe this little definition's helpful. Partiality is treating someone a certain way because of something about them that shouldn't affect how you treat them. Let me say it again. Treating someone a certain way because of something about them that shouldn't affect how you treat them. If you're still confused, hopefully just looking at the example will help us. And their example of partiality or favoritism is them treating the rich well, being really welcoming towards them but not towards the poor. It's a kind of discrimination, and it's really serious. And so James gives them an example of what they're not to do. He says, imagine two people come into the church service. Imagine it's busy and it's not that noticeable to everyone. But in the end, two people come in, one dressed well. Everything about him is impressive. Looks like someone that you kind of want to talk to. Looks like he can hold a conversation. Dressed well, as we said, clearly quite wealthy. And then another one comes in who's not dressed well. He doesn't look good. He's not impressive. Maybe his smell's a bit bad, a bit of a weird mixture of alcohol and BO. Not the kind of person that you immediately want to go to. And James says, imagine the rich person is welcomed, brought to a good seat and given a good handshake, given a Bible, given the bulletin and told, feel at home here, you are welcome and we want you to be with us. But with the poor man, well, they let him in. They think to themselves, maybe it would be wrong not to. And they think maybe we're welcoming, so we will bring him in. But he's a bit awkward, isn't he? Let's keep him at the side so that he doesn't cause too much trouble or be a distraction for people. If they've done this, then they have shown favoritism. They've been showing discrimination. And as James says in verse 4, they would have become judges with evil thoughts. Those are serious accusations, aren't they? You see, the real problem in this situation is the attitude that the people would have towards the two men who came through the door. They preferred one over the other. They viewed one as superior to the other, as more important. And James is saying, never do that. That is wrong. Why might they have done this? Maybe in this church they needed money, and they thought, here's someone who's well-dressed, he's rich, he'll be useful for us. Maybe he'll put some money into our box at the back, and he'll be a valuable asset. Whereas the poor man, well, he'll be more effort than he is worth. He would require our charity. He would require difficult decisions to be made and conversations about how we can help him, and it's just going to be a challenge. Or maybe they thought, well, if we get this rich man into our church, we'll look good, and we can be proud of him. But if we have someone like that poor man in, then we're not going to look so good to the outsiders, are we? And I think maybe they knew they were supposed to love their neighbor and welcome people, and they thought, well, if we welcome this rich man, that's basically an easy way of obeying that command. He's not going to be that difficult to love, so let's love him as our neighbor. They had shown partiality among themselves and become judges with evil thoughts. And I think behind this attitude is arrogance, being judgmental, an assumption that some people are superior to others. We hear the words discrimination and inequality, and we know deep down, all of us, inside and outside the church, know those are wrong attitudes. They're deeply wrong. And we know this to say it, but I wonder if sometimes in our heart, with our attitude towards people, we show it. And so James has given this church the example, and I'm sure it hit them hard. And I wonder in what ways might we be similar as a church? For them, the problem was treating the rich with favoritism, but what people might we treat with favoritism? The real problem is any kind of judgment that causes division in the church. We need to make sure that we don't make the same attitude mistake, the same heart mistake, and just have it play out in different ways. You see, they needed a rich man in their church. What kind of a man do we think we need in our church? Maybe we think we could really do with someone who's really intelligent, or someone with a great reputation and status, or maybe someone who's just cool. What do we think we need in our church? And how would we treat them compared to someone who we didn't think we need as much? Now remember, this is all about our attitudes towards people. And so I think it's helpful for us to know that it will be normal for us to have more time with certain people as opposed to others. So if you think about yourselves, if you think that, well, a lot of my life and service seems to go towards one kind of person, that might necessarily be a problem. Because your attitude towards all people might still be quite good. You see, some people will have more opportunities to love one group of people as opposed to another. Maybe someone has got a real heart for children and has lots of chances to serve children. Another person loves the academically minded and kind of works with them and tries to evangelize to them and gets on well with them. Or someone might work almost entirely with women or with men. The question would be, what is your attitude towards the people that are different from them? Do you think that your group of people is more valuable than another person's group? And what would you do if the opportunity came to serve someone who didn't quite fit in your category? Would you take that opportunity and love them as your neighbors as well? Or would you say, well, that's not really my remit. I'll leave that up to someone else who's more of an expert in that field. These are the things that James wants the church to think through so that we're making sure that we don't discriminate in any way. You see, the church is a body, and we're supposed to obey this command to love our neighbor together, to encourage each other to love all kinds of people that might come through our doors. We can't let favoritism, partiality, discrimination be any part of church life. Because here, in church, as God's people, this should be known as the ultimate place of equality. We know everyone stands either equally condemned by God, if they don't know Jesus yet, or else equally and fully forgiven by God, if they do have the faith in Jesus that James mentions. Imagine we all always had the attitude that there's God and then there's people. God alone and then all people, all on a level standing. Again, we know to say this when we're asked, but is our attitude really like that? Can you imagine having a full day, a full week, where you just looked at everyone and thought they are all valuable, just as valuable as me, just as valuable as each other? Just looking at God and saying, wow, worship. And looking at people and saying, respect, care, love. That's what I need to show towards them. We as a church need to make sure that everyone who comes through the doors is made welcome by us, because we know that they're welcome by God. We need to show them in whatever way we can that they are worth our time, worth our money, worth a listening ear, because we know that's how God sees them. And we also know, if we're Christians who have believed in Jesus, that that's how God saw us. And that takes us on to verse 5 and our second point. You see, having told the people what not to do, James now starts to explain why they should act this way. And he also goes on to show how. So we have seen what God doesn't want from them. And now, when we first of all look at God's example, we begin to see why we need to have this attitude. Have a look at verse 5. Has not God chosen the poor in this world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he promised to those who love him? You see, there's no doubt that one of the best ways of teaching, if you're a parent or anyone else, is to give an example to someone, to show them by example. And that is what God has done for us. Has not God chosen the poor? No, he didn't only choose poor people, but the point James is making is that he is willing to choose anyone. He doesn't consider our reputation or how much we might bring to his kingdom-building plan. He chooses us, whether we're rich or poor or smart or not so smart, no matter what we're like. He shows impartiality. In fact, the pattern that we see in the Bible is that God is pleased to save those who are most helpless. Let me read 1 Corinthians 1:26-27. This is Paul writing, and he says, not many were wise from a human perspective. Not many were powerful, not many were of noble birth. God has chosen what is insignificant and despised, what is viewed as nothing, so that no one may boast in his presence. He's saying that if we look at the church around the world, we will see that God is willing to save those who are despised and rejected and unimpressive, like the poor man who came through the door in James's story. And we see it in the gospel, don't we? God chooses sinners from all backgrounds to be forgiven, to become his children, his people. As he tells Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and compassion on whom I have compassion. It does not depend on human will or effort, but on God who shows mercy. He sent Jesus to save everyone. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. So the point is, if God is willing to choose everyone, then we should be the same. And look at verse 5 again, and we see that those who were chosen become rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom. James is reminding them that if God has chosen you, you are brought into his family. You're his children. And if you're his children, he will make you rich, and he is making you heirs to his kingdom. And then he goes on to say that they will be the ones who love him. If you are blessed with good parents, don't you just love them? It comes naturally because you know them and you see your care for them. So it is with God's children. They will then go on and love him. And then we remember when Jesus is asked, what's the most important command? He says, to love the Lord your God. And then he's asked, what is the second most important? And he says, to love your neighbor. And we can see that the two are closely linked. James then goes on to mention that actually the rich among these people are oppressing them, dragging them into courts, blaspheming them. You see, rich people, rather than being particularly good and useful for kingdom building, they've got real obstacles. Jesus talks, doesn't he, about how difficult it is for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. James warns them numerous times in this letter that they need to humble themselves. Have a look at chapter 1, or maybe you remember when that was preached to us. Later in chapter 5, we'll see that he makes similar warnings. The rich people need to be careful because there are things that they have that might take them away from God. You see, we don't need to be tactical thinking about who God needs. Instead, we need to just ask, who does God want to show mercy to? And we know, as the saying goes, that little is much when God is in it. So we, as a church here, Hillfields Church Coventry, need to look at our neighbours and say, who here needs God's mercy? We will see, if we look around us, that there are many poor people. We can be thankful that they don't have certain obstacles in their way, and we can confidently bring the gospel to them and hope and pray that they see God's mercy and that they realize they need him. So James says the first and biggest reasons for not showing favoritism is because that is the way that God has treated us. But James doesn't stop there. Instead, he carries on with verses 8 to 11. And really what he does is he goes on to say that this not showing favoritism, it's all about loving your neighbor. James gets the church to think about themselves. He wants them to stop loving just some of their neighbors and start loving all of them. I wonder if they just looked at verse 8, they would feel quietly pleased with themselves. As James says, if you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you do well. I wonder if some of them thought, well, we're doing well. But actually, if they look at the rest of the things that James is saying, they'll see that he's bringing them down and humbling them and showing them that there is a deeper and richer way of showing love to all your neighbors. And again, they might think to themselves, well, at least we loved some people. Isn't that better than none? Isn't that better than nothing? But that's not what God asks from us. He doesn't say, love some of your neighbors. He says, love your neighbors as yourselves. I remember breaking a garage window at home. Imagine after I had done that and Dad had found out, my defense had been, but look at the kitchen window. It's fine. Doesn't that make me innocent? It would be ridiculous, wouldn't it? Or imagine a man in court accused of murder saying he's innocent because he didn't steal from the person he murdered. It would be ridiculous. In the same way, we need to ask the question, are we obeying all of God's law to us? Are we loving all of our neighbors and not just some? Because if we haven't, then James says they are guilty of breaking all of the law and convicted by the law as transgressors. But for God's children, living in faith, as he says, holding on to the faith, fixing their eyes on Jesus, Christ, the Lord of glory, for people doing that, there is a way of obedience. And that is to live by the law of liberty, which James mentions in verses 12 to 13. You see, at this stage, you might feel a little bit hopeless or discouraged. The readers might have gone from thinking, aren't we doing well, to thinking, oh, we're not doing well, to even thinking it's impossible to do this. This is beyond us. So how can we love our neighbors as ourselves? James says we need to speak and act as those who will be judged by the law of liberty. And I think this takes us back to what we said earlier about the fact that we are now God's children and not his slaves. So what is the law of liberty? Well, the law was given, God's good law was given before Jesus came. But by itself, it proved to be powerless to change the people trying to obey it. It may have improved their behavior and this had value, but by itself, without faith in God's Messiah, people were not able to obey it and certainly were not able to change themselves from within. I want us to have a look at the end of Galatians 3 and the start of Galatians 4 because I think this helps us understand what's going on here. Do have a closer look yourself later, maybe read it alongside these verses in James. But now let me just pick out a couple of things it says which I think help us know what it means to live under the law of liberty. So from Galatians 3:22 through to Galatians 4:1 verse 7, just have a glance if you can. We're told that we were confined under the law, imprisoned. The law was our guardian. Again, this is maybe reminding us of the language of being slaves. But then we're told, since faith has come, since the Redeemer has come, we are no longer under a guardian, that is the law. For through faith that we have in Jesus, we are all sons of God in Christ Jesus. And again, towards the end of chapter 3, now there is no Jew or Gentile, slave or free, male or female. We are all equal. We can all be heirs of God. Isn't this the ultimate anti-discrimination verse? The ultimate verse for promoting equality within the church. And then he goes on to say in Galatians 4:1-7 that we were just like slaves until Jesus came and redeemed his people. But now instead of being like slaves, they are like heirs, capable of obeying the law. And then if you look at Galatians 5:13-14, I think this really helps us. He goes on to say, you were called to be free, but don't use this freedom for the flesh. Serve one another in love, for the whole law is fulfilled in love your neighbor as yourself. See, we're talking about the law of liberty in James 2, and we're talking about freedom here in Galatians 5, and we're talking about loving your neighbor as yourself in both. So because of Jesus bringing us into God's family as his children, we know that we are now able to be obedient towards God. The law of liberty, the law of freedom, means that we're free from sin, free from God's condemnation, and free to love our neighbor. You see, doing that, if you're a Christian, should no longer be unnatural to you or impossible for you. Instead, we're God's children, born by the word of truth, as James says earlier in chapter 1, and the first fruits of his creation. We're born again, born to be like him and to love others in the way that he has loved us. So loving our neighbor, if we're a Christian, really is possible. God looks at us as his children. And James is reminding us that we need to live our lives in view of the judgment that will come. God will judge. He will ask, have we loved our neighbor as ourselves? And if you're his children, this isn't a judgment that you worry about. Don't be worried that he's going to condemn you. But instead, think this is an opportunity to please God and to go and to love others as he wants you to. So the law of liberty enables us to go and live as God's children, guided by Christ, guided by love, imitating God's example, because we're able to, because he is our Father. And James closes by reminding us that judgment is without mercy to the one who has not shown mercy, and mercy triumphs over judgment. This is similar to what Jesus says in Matthew 5 when he says, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy." If you remember the sermon that we had here on that verse, we know that being merciful doesn't just mean not judging people. It means being good to them, like the Good Samaritan was good to the neighbor on the road, robbed. Real mercy is generosity and care and love for our neighbors. And one of the questions put to us on Judgment Day, put to all people, will be, has this man, has this woman, has this child received mercy? Have they received God's mercy? And if they have, then the evidence will prove it, because they will have gone on to show mercy to others. You see, again, James isn't said that you be justified by your mercy and your works, but he's saying that people who get it, people who see Jesus' love, Jesus' mercy, they don't go around trying to get things from other people. Instead, they go around looking for opportunities to love their neighbors, looking for opportunities to love all of their neighbors, whether they're similar to them, different, easy to get on with, difficult. That's what people who have really understood Jesus' mercy towards them will do. So God has brought us into his house as his children, and he is teaching us all the time, just as he's teaching here through James, how to live like his children. It seems at times like he's asking a lot from us, but he teaches us. And he has given us new life so that we can really grow up to be like Christ, his son. And as James says, this is all possible if we hold on to our faith and keep our eyes on our glorious Lord Jesus Christ. So I hope that we believe that if we're Christians, we can go and love all of our neighbors. Amen.